To introduce our author this evening, we have the very esteemed Bertha Vasquez on hand with us. Bertha Vasquez has been teaching middle school science in Miami-Dade County Public Schools for 24 years. An educator with national board certification, she is the recipient of several national and local honors, including the 2014 Samsung's $150,000 Solve for Tomorrow contest and the Charles C. Bartlett National Excellence in Environmental Award in 2009. She was Miami-Dade Science Teacher of the Year in 1997 and 2008, and is currently one of Florida's 2015 finalists for the most prestigious science award in the country, the Presidential Award for Excellence in Mathematics and Science and Teaching. Bertha is also director of TIES, the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science, a project of the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science. Let's give them both a nice warm welcome.
Hi, everybody. Let me make sure this is on. Yes, it is on. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. Thank you for coming. It's an honor to be here. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Kathleen, which is the reason we're here, and her many accomplishments. She's written about science for many prestigious national magazines over the years, including The Atlantic, Smithsonian, the New York Times Magazine, and Discover Magazine. Her work has appeared in the Best American Science Writing, and she has received numerous journalism awards and has been the recipient of fellowships from such prestigious groups as the Alicia Patterson Foundation and the Marine Biology Laboratory at Woods Hole. And I have to say that her talent is on full display in this book, which I loved. As a teacher, I found it so readable. It was beautifully written. It makes difficult topic easy to understand, and it also makes it relevant to our lives, which is something very important to transmit that in the classroom. So I'd like to just turn it over right. Oh, I also saw this morning, by the way, that this book is one of the top 10 best books of June 2016, according to Amazon's editors, which is really awesome. Rock star. So I would like her to start, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, I'd like you to start, Kathleen, with maybe like a 30-second trailer of your book for the people here tonight.
Sure. I first, though, want to explain what I mean by parasite, because there's a lot of confusion about that. And a parasite is any organism that cannot live independent of another. Typically, it's a small organism that lives inside a larger organism. And it includes pathogenic bacteria and viruses, not just larger organisms that I think most of us think of when we say parasite. Yes, I do mean lice and mites and leeches and tapeworms, but I also mean microbes too, pathogenic microbes. And briefly, hard to put this in 30 words or 30 seconds.
I'll give you 40.
Okay, thank you. Briefly, the book is about all the different ways that parasites alter the way we think, feel, and act. And there are a few ways they do this. There is a class of organisms called parasitic manipulators. They were once thought to be very rare, but now experts in the field think they're much, much more common than realized. And these organisms typically invade an animal, and they can do all kinds of things. For example, they can tinker with the neurocircuits of their host. Sometimes they change the hormone levels or levels of neurochemicals. They've got a whole bunch of different tactics that allow them to basically make the host behave the way they want it to. And then the second part of my book, I look at the flip side to this, which is how humans and other animals protect themselves from parasites. And we have evolved a complex series of behavioral adaptations that kick in the moment we feel like we're at threat of becoming sick. And just a few examples would be, for example, if an animal is injured, like cats or primates and so on, what are the things they'll do is they will lick their wound. And the reason they do that is because saliva is rich in antimicrobial compounds. And animals across nature almost routinely shun their feces. We are not alone. Feces are, filled with all kinds of nasty pathogens that could harm us. And similarly, animals shun their feces. So these are some of the kinds of behaviors we'll be talking about tonight.
Now, I know this book was partially inspired by an article that you wrote for The Atlantic. Could you explain what that article was and how it led to this entire book?
Yes, yes. Okay, one day I was just...
Please.
Can you hear me better now? Is that much better?
Yeah, put it.
I don't think it's on.
Yeah, it's on. Just hold it.
Okay, is that better? Can everybody hear me?
Try that.
Is that better? Okay, sorry about that, folks. Yes, so what happened is one day while, surfing the internet looking for interesting topics to write about, I came across an article about a parasite, a one-celled protozoan that invades the brain of rats, and it turns its innate fear of cats into an attraction. And when I say attraction, I mean sexual attraction. The rodents become sexually aroused by the scent of cat urine.
That's a very bad thing for a mouse to be.
Yes. And what I learned is, needless to say, that the rat soon ends up in the belly of a cat, which of course is very convenient for the cat, but I was also stunned to learn it was very convenient for the parasite because the feline gut is the only place where this parasite can sexually reproduce. And when I continued reading, I learned that about 30% of people around the world have this parasite in their brains, the vast majority of them completely ignorant of the fact, and that some scientists were concerned that it might actually be altering our behavior too. So I called up a neuroscientist at Stanford who was mentioned in the article, and I asked him about this, and he said, I think there could be something to this, and you really should speak to this scientist in Prague, a biologist. Give him a call. He's a bit of a wild man, but I think it will be worth your time to talk to him. This is Jaroslav Flager.
He looks like a wild man.
Yeah. And when I talked to Jaroslav, he proceeded to tell me, I think, the single wildest story I have ever heard over the span of my career. He told me that he has this parasite in his brain and that he's convinced it's the reason he has sort of a reckless streak about him. And I said, well, what makes you think this? How did you come to this conclusion? Thinking, he's got to be a real kook. And he told me how he had, for years, since his early 20s, he just noticed that he was very strange. Like he would walk out into the middle of dense traffic, and if a car honked on him, he wouldn't jump out of the way. At the time, Czechoslovakia was under Soviet domination. He made no effort to disguise his hatred of the regime. He said, I don't even know how I didn't end up in jail. And something else that really concerned him was once on a visit to Turkey, he got caught in the middle of a gun battle between the Turks and the Turkish government and the Kurds. And he immediately took cover, but as bullets are whistling overhead, he kept thinking, why am I not afraid? What is wrong with me? So move forward a decade or so, and I think it was around in his early 40s, a colleague asked him if he would participate in a clinical trial because he was having trouble rounding up enough subjects. And this colleague was trying to develop an improved test for Toxoplasma gondii, which is the name of this parasite I just told you about. So Jaroslav agreed to participate, and he shortly found out that indeed he had the parasite. He had heard a little bit about parasitic manipulators, in fact, from your boss, Richard Dawkins, a famous evolutionary biologist, because a decade or two earlier, Dawkins had briefly mentioned parasitic manipulators in one of his books, and it made a huge impression on Jaroslav. So he thought, when he found out that he had this parasite, he thought, maybe this parasite is manipulating my brain too. And then he did a lot of reading, and he discovered that, how the parasite, there were signs that maybe it might be manipulating cats. So he launched some of the first studies of humans, and he found lots of strange differences between people who were infected and people who weren't. So people who were infected had slightly slower reaction times. They were a little bit more easily distracted. He conducted some studies and discovered that they were more likely to be in car accidents, like about 2.7 times more likely to be in car accidents.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, and then a few other groups have since reproduced that finding. Groups in other countries, they've also found that people who test positive for the parasite are more likely to be in car crashes. And then both Yaroslav and other groups have also connected the parasite to a number of mental disorders. So, for example, people who test positive for the parasite are at slightly increased risk of suffering from schizophrenia or having bipolar disorder. They're also at increased risk of committing suicide or attempting to kill themselves. There have been a few very well conducted studies in Europe where they've actually shown that that suicidal behavior increases in direct proportion to the prevalence of the parasite in different countries. I think that was a study involving about 22 or so countries. So the parasite has been, over the years and repeatedly, again and again, connected to various behavioral disturbances. However, I don't want to freak anybody out.
Yeah, I was going to ask, who has cats? Can you teach proper kitty litter disposal procedure here? Because
thank you so much. In fact, I didn't even really explain how this parasite gets into our brains. And one of the ways is changing a cat litter box. Other ways include gardening if you don't wash your hands properly afterwards, because the cats basically defecate the parasite, that they shed the eggs of this parasite in their feces.
And also, I mean, I know for pregnant women, they should avoid cat litter for that reason, because it could actually cause serious neurological damage to a child.
That's correct.
Baby.
That's correct. If a woman is exposed to the parasite during pregnancy, it doesn't matter if she was exposed before pregnancy, but if it actually occurs during pregnancy, the parasite can do damage to the baby's nervous system or even trigger a miscarriage. So there's a few ways you can get it. I mentioned, changing cat litter, gardening. If you don't really thoroughly scrub vegetables, there's still dirt particles on it. You can get it that way. Another way you can get the parasite, and in fact it may be a rather common way at that, is by eating undercooked lamb or beef. And the reason for that is because grazing cattle can pick up the eggs, and it then gets incorporated into their flesh, which of course is the meat that we eat. So those are some of the ways that this parasite ends up in our brain. For example, in France, 50% of people are infected with the parasite, and that's probably because they love their meat saignant, literally bleeding.
I saw one statistic where doctors checked people who came into hospital emergency rooms, victims of high-speed motorcycle accidents, which means they're engaging in risky behavior, and they had a much higher infection rate than. But I know you brought some slides with you. Let's talk about zombie ants.
Okay.
Zombie ants, tapeworm, parasitic barnacles. Oh my gosh.
Okay. These are zombie ants. These ants have picked up spores, fungal spores, on the ground, and these spores then hatch and they burrow into the ant. There's nothing docile about these spores. They immediately start wildly proliferating inside the ant, and they begin churning out chemicals that tell the ant to go to the nearest sapling and at exactly solar noon to climb 1 foot up from the ground and then go to the underside of a leaf on the northwestern quadrant of the plant.
I wish my students listened to me that perfectly.
And to lock onto the main vein of the leaf. And then, like in the iconic scene in Alien, the fungus sprouts from its head. It grows this long stalk with fruiting bodies, 1 or 2, and then those explode, raining spores down on more ants who are passing by below, creating, new armies of zombie ants. And this is not a rare phenomenon. It wasn't discovered until about, I think, 2005, 2008, which is very surprising because in rainforests around the world, you can find many of them, like about 20 or so per square yard. So they're a very important part of our ecosystem, these zombie ants. Now I will show you another. What you are looking at here are tiny brine shrimp gathered together into swarms. Brine shrimp, they've gathered together. They're swarming together. Brine shrimp are like spindly little shrimp. They're not much longer than my fingernail. And they're normally translucent. But when a tapeworm invades the shrimp, it turns its normally translucent host bright pink, and it then encourages it to socialize with other shrimp. So all the infected shrimp gather together, and they form these bright red clouds in the water that can be as much as 1 meter or so wide. This is very nice for flamingos because they feed on these shrimp. So all they need to do is, dip their ladle-shaped beak into this red seafood broth at their feet, and they've gotten a mouth full of shrimp. The flamingo, as you've probably guessed by now, is the parasite's next host. And one of the scientists who studied this phenomenon, his name is Nicholas Rode. He said, we really have to rethink what we observe in nature, because he said, normally when we see animals in herds or flocks or shoals, we assume that they're gathering together for their own benefit, to fend off predators or maybe to help them be more effective foraging, or perhaps, to find a sexual mate. But he said perhaps far more often than we realize, parasites may be hurting hurting their current host straight into the jaws of their next host. This looks like a crab, right? It's really, believe it or not, a barnacle that is masquerading as a crab. This is not really a crab. Suspend any preconceived notions you have about barnacles, because this barnacle is exceedingly iconoclastic. What it does is it alights on a crab, and then it injects a tiny clump of its cells into the crab. And then those cells start growing into a dense tangle of roots that wraps around all of the crab's internal organs. Now, while this is happening, the crab is behaving just like any normal crab. It will be, trolling the shoreline, munching on mollusks. But all the food that it gathers is basically fueling, the overthrow of its rule. Because the parasitic barnacle eventually sterilizes the crab, and where the crab would normally grow a brood pouch on its underbelly to incubate its young, the parasitic barnacle, it pushes out outside what it does is it grows a brood pouch of its own in exactly the same spot. So that yellow bladder-shaped organ that you see in the picture on the underside of the crab, that's actually filled with the parasite's young. And when they're ready to be born, the crab will go into deep water and it will bob up and down, releasing them in great pulses, and it will stir the water with its claws to send them on their way so that they can commandeer the minds and bodies of more crabs. And you might think these parasitic barnacles to be very rare, but they're not, in fact. And this is one of the big surprises about parasitic manipulators. About 20% of the crabs in Danish fjords have been colonized by this parasitic barnacle. In Hawaii, about half of the crabs have been colonized by these parasitic barnacles. They are robo-crabs. And in some parts of the Mediterranean, 100% of the crabs are really this parasitic barnacle. They're being controlled by this parasitic barnacle, like an amphibious robot, basically. A few more interesting examples.
Oh, is this the hammock?
This is the spider.
This is my favorite.
Okay, what you're looking at here, you see a spider on the left-hand side of the screen. I don't know if you can see it, but there is a tiny little white glob on one side of the spider. And that is the egg of a parasitic wasp. The wasp attached it there, and as the egg develops into a little larva, it produces a lot of chemicals. And these chemicals tell the spider to build the wasp basically a custom design nursery. So the spider abandons its normal weaving style, and in this case you can see that the normal weaving style is in the center, and to the far right you can see a pretty crazy looking web.
What's amazing to me is that is not a simple change of behavior. That is a complex web design being turned into basically a hammock over there. That's unbelievable. That's a lot of brain chemistry changes going on.
It is, and the scientists who study this are absolutely dumbfounded by how the parasitic wasp, how that larvae can communicate such fine instructions to the spider to elicit that kind of behavior. And in fact, the wasp actually goads the spider into producing a decorative motif in the center of the web, which camouflages the wasp's larva from its enemies.
So, there's more?
I'm not sure if there's more, but let me see.
Oh, that's the
No,
next
that's
part.
the next part.
There's plenty more in the first part of the book that she didn't mention that I really think you should check out. There's zombie roaches, and there's suicidal grasshoppers that jump into pools, and all sorts of other stuff. But right before the second part of the book, you take a break from parasites and you go into our own microbiome, our biome, the flora of our own guts. And could you take a moment to explain that, the importance that scientists are finding in the bacteria? 9 out of every 10 of your cells are not human cells. You are a community. And so have a look, explain that, because that is...
Yes. Okay. The bacteria in your gut, I don't want to give you the impression that they're parasites, but I included them in my book because it's an example of how our behavior can be manipulated unbeknownst to ourselves by another organism. The bacteria in our gut, some of them produce 1, 2, or more neurotransmitters. They're exactly identical to the neurotransmitters found in your brain. And through a variety of mechanisms, they can influence our behavior. So our behavior is not just governed from the top down, but literally from the bottom up. And another way that they can influence our behavior is when the bacteria are breaking down the food that we eat, they can produce or psychoactive compounds that can also act on our brain. So there's a variety of different ways they influence our behavior. But scientists now think that to varying degrees, the bacteria in your gut determine whether you're happy or sad, anxious or calm, energetic or sluggish, or even by helping to regulate the hormones that your own body produces to control your appetite. They may even determine whether you're fat or thin, or at least weigh in on the matter.
And
So
you have the experiment in your book about the mice where they took the gut flora of an obese mouse and put it in a skinny mouse and vice versa. And the obese mouse actually lost weight with the gut flora of the thin mouse, which is unbelievable.
yeah, and they've done something
Much
comparable.
for exercise. Switch bacteria on you.
Yeah.
Wow.
They've done something comparable. They've taken their strains of mice that have different kinds of personalities. And scientists can rear animals in such a way that they're born completely free of their normal gut microflora. And what they've done is they've transferred bacteria that's normally found in one strain into another strain. And in this way, they've been able to basically transplant personalities. So the recipient displays a personality that's more typical of the donor. So if the donor is like more aggressive and gregarious, then the mouse that receives it will be that way, even though it might normally have been a more much less aggressive and not as social. So you can get this swapping of personalities. There's one other thing that I think is very interesting about gut bacteria, and scientists discovered this again by studying animals that don't have the normal microflora, and they are very strange creatures. So a normal mouse, for example, with a normal gut microbiota is an eager learner, very curious. If you put a napkin ring in its cage, it will circle it and sniff it with great interest. When you put them in a maze, it's keen to explore new arms of the maze. Well, the same mouse, the same strain of mouse without the normal gut microbiota is not very curious. It's a slow learner. It doesn't remember where it's been, and it doesn't avoid wide open spaces and brightly lit areas, which would scream danger to a normal mouse. And it isn't even distressed when it's separated from its mother early in life, which normally if you separate a mouse from its mother, it will protest, and they cry. But you don't see any of that behavior in the animals that are free of bacteria. So clearly, the bacteria in our gut have a big impact on our behavior.
Wow. I think we could all think about the many repercussions that could have in our own worlds and medicine and psychology and everything. So that's, basically the first half of the book is what parasites do to us. And then the second half of the book, if you consider that animals, including humans, have been evolving with these parasites for millions of years, it's called coevolution. We've evolved very complex defense behaviors or defense mechanisms to fight off these parasites. And so the second half of Kathleen's book is even more interesting, I think. And could you go into and talks more about humans, the second half of the book. What kind of complex behavioral defenses have we evolved to fight off these marauding hordes of parasites?
First off, a lot of us have a mental shield against parasites that few of us know we possess. And scientists call it our behavioral immune system. And the way it works is like this. As you're basically moving about your environment, a part of your mind is scanning your surroundings for signs of contaminants, grimy fingerprints, gum stuck to the side of a desk, garbage on the floor.
Dog poo.
Yeah, dog poop,
Rotting
for sure.
food.
Yeah, rancid odors. When this part of our brain spots contaminants, it raises our disgust level and causes us to withdraw from the threat. A lot of the time, we're not even conscious of the fact that we're doing this. One of my favorite studies was done in a supermarket, and it found that shoppers are less likely to buy food, even goodies like cookies, if they come within 1 inch of touching products that we associate with filth or bodily waste. So, for example, diapers or tampons or garbage bags. Another example of it, you see these slides here, you can see that if you ask people, there was a study actually done of, there were over 100 participants in this study because it was done by a British researcher named Valerie Curtis in collaboration with the BBC. At any rate, they mixed up a whole bunch of pictures of this sort, and they had people rank them based on how disgusting they found them. And people all over the world ranked the sides on the left-hand side as more disgusting. As you can see, those pictures, they're more disease salient, if you will. This fellow, he looks like he might have a fever and maybe a rash on his face, for example. So our minds are constantly scanning for contaminants. And one thing that's particularly interesting about our behavioral immune system is that it pays very close attention to other people because we are leading sources of infection. And but because our behavioral immune system is not guided by sophisticated reasoning, it can lock onto any abnormality, contagious or not. So, for example, it locks onto, it will trigger disgust if it locks onto a snotty nose or an oozing eye. But it can also trigger disgust in response to acne or a prominent mole or even excess body fat. So it's a very crudely calibrated system. And another aspect about the behavioral immune system that is a little strange is that especially if we're in an unsanitary environment or we're prompted to think about germs, it can trigger feelings of repulsion towards groups that we perceive to be of a different race or ethnicity. And one of the reasons scientists speculate this happens is because over our long history, people from faraway lands were more likely to carry germs for which the local population would have no natural resistance, so they would be particularly virulent germs. And our behavioral immune system is also disgusted by people who break societal norms, which is a strange finding when you think about it. But the reason the scientists theorize this happens actually I think makes quite a bit of sense, which is that a lot of customs have the hidden function of protecting us from germs. So, for example, conservative sexual mores, washing before prayer, culinary practices, only marrying within your religious group, bowing instead of handshaking. A lot of customs may have the function of keeping us safe from parasites.
Which makes me think about one of the things that she mentions in the book that's very interesting to me is that the Torah that was written, thousands of years ago, can be considered in some ways the first medical text. Now, these people had no clue what a bacteria was or anything like that, but they knew which behaviors could protect them from sickness, basically.
That's right. Some of the world's most commonly practiced religions today, Judaism being a leading example, Hinduism is another, but they arose at a time when infectious disease was exploding. Hunter-gatherers do not get that many diseases. You have to have a certain size population before disease can spread like wildfire. And it was just at the point in time when populations in the Middle East and in a few other parts of the world were, increasing into, many millions. that you start to see this explosion of infectious disease and the birth of some of the first religions that are based where they emphasize moral behavior, following certain prescribed ways of behaving. And Judaism, excuse me, is a particularly interesting example because this is, of course, long before anybody knew the first thing about germ theory. The very rabbis were told by God's decree, rabbis were told that they should wash their hands. And rabbis are the main healers in their community, and washing hands is perhaps the single most effective defense against infectious disease that we know of even today. And there's other common admonitions in Judaism that are probably familiar to a lot of you, such as not to eat pork, which can cause trichinosis, to circumcise sons, which is thought to probably protect against STDs and maybe urinary tract infections in infants. But there's actually just a whole bunch of other parts of the Torah that relate to infectious disease, so many that it's truly extraordinary. For example, early Jews were told to cover their wells, which is a very good idea because it keeps out insects and vermin. They were told that after using eating utensils, to put them in boiling water. They were told to not to eat any animal that had been felled by natural causes, and of course, such an animal may well have died of an infectious disease. And they were told to bury their dead within 2 or 3 days, just around the time that the corpse is about to decompose. And it gets even more involved than that. I mean, it's truly extraordinary, the full range of...
And to shun people who don't do these things kind of comes along with it hand in hand, too, right? To homeless people, so...
Yes, at a certain point, somehow parasites, if you will, became embedded in our morals. We shun people who break rules, and so a lot of those first rules related to infectious disease. But over time, we started to shun people that broke a much broader range of rules, societal rules. And when I say that parasites are sort of embedded in our morals, a very strange phenomenon is that when we are thinking about parasitic disease, we are much harsher in our judgment of anyone who even the most minor of transgressions, not returning a stolen wallet, lying on your resume, or far more ethically fraught, turning to cannibalism to survive a plane crash in a remote area, all become more repugnant, more reprehensible if you're worried about infectious disease, or if you're in an unsanitary environment. Even like seemingly, harmless sex acts, like masturbating while clutching a teddy bear, or having sex in your grandmother's bed while she's, while you're house sitting for her, all become far more reprehensible if you're worried about infection.
The latter part of your book becomes a little bit more controversial as you start discussing societal tendencies, political tendencies, how politicians use our fear of foreign things that may, in our primitive brains, bring us infection. How do you feel about this the controversial part of your book is probably bringing certain kinds of reviewers to your book, and tell them about the more controversial subjects that are involved here.
Sure. Okay, you can look away. All right, you've seen it. I guess I can go back to the other one. All right.
That's pretty bad too, actually.
Where's the cupcake slide?
The more repulsed you are by that picture of the guy swallowing worms, the more likely you will hold conservative political beliefs. I know that sounds absolutely bizarre, but there's actually a lot of evidence that supports this.
You're telling me about the map today. The map with the disgust factor and then the voting map on top, and how there was a...
Yeah. I'll get into that in just a moment, but let's dissect what conservative values are really all about. First off, conservative sexual values. People who are conservative tend to be a little bit more ethnocentric. They stick with their own kinds. They're more likely to be opposed to immigration, for example. And there's a whole constellation of attitudes. You'll find that, for example, being anti-gay rights, a whole constellation of attitudes separate conservatives and liberals. And when you look at the most divisive issues, they're all about social behaviors with direct relevance to the transmission of disease.
Or what our crudely calibrated system considers.
Yes, that's a very important point to make, because obviously, that a lot of things that trigger our disgust sensitivity in no way pose any threat to us whatsoever. So, yeah, I mean, like somebody of a different ethnicity or whatever. No, you don't have to worry about that. But in the past, I guess because that's the way our minds are wired, we have a lot of aversions that are just the side effect of a crudely calibrated behavioral immune system. But there's actually been a lot of research done on this, and there was, for example, a study done in 2008 when it was the election between John McCain and Barack Obama. And the investigators looked at a nationally representative sample of people in every state. And they found that those who said that they were most likely to vote for John McCain, they tested highest of all on a standardized test of their disgust sensitivity. And then after the election, they looked at the average disgust sensitivity score of each state by averaging all the respondents from that state, what their average disgust level was. And they could actually predict the proportion of votes that went to John McCain. And they subsequently conducted a much larger study of, I think it was 122 different nations, and they found that the same correlation between disgust sensitivity and conservative values. So there's a lot of research that makes this connection. It sounds crazy, but I think there's something to it.
Because, I mean, millions of years ago, even hundreds of millions of years ago, or even just when Columbus came to South America, someone of another group can carry disease. Not the case anymore,
Yeah.
but our brains are wired that way.
Yes, and of course we have antibiotics, so of course, sex is no longer as risky. Of course, it also helps to have birth control too. But obviously, this is a new phenomenon, and in the past, sex was actually one of the single riskiest things you could do. So, and in fact, interestingly, just a little factoid, is that lust suppresses disgust. This is very important, or we would have long ago gone extinct. I mean, think about it. It's like serious mixing of bodily fluids. So,
And also, you're much more likely to share a toothbrush with your spouse because if they got germs, you probably got them at this point too, than with a stranger.
that's
Right.
right. They've done a lot of research, and they've shown that, for example, people admire their own bowels, but needless to say, are repelled by others. Or, their baby's diapers don't stink as much as somebody else's baby's diapers. And as Bertha just pointed out, we would never share a toothbrush with a stranger. So yes, another aspect of disgust that's interesting is women, I think, have long suspected they're more disgust sensitive than men, and indeed, research shows this is true. And probably the reason for it, it's theorized, is because women have the double burden of protecting both themselves and their young children from infection.
I know we're kind of going back a little bit, but some of the other behaviors that we've evolved to protect us, for example, sympathy vomiting. Could you talk about sympathy vomiting?
Bertha's particularly fond of this one. I'm not sure why.
It's amazing, but it's true.
It's called sympathetic vomiting.
Sympathetic,
Yeah.
excuse me.
No, but basically, if you see someone vomit, you're more likely to vomit too. I had a famous birthday party when I was a kid. When
We don't have to go there.
All right, we won't. I'll get to the point quickly. But basically, the reason probably we evolved sympathetic vomiting is because in generations past, food poisoning was far more common and lethal. So, imagine sitting around a primeval campfire, enjoying a communal meal of antelope stew, when the person next to you starts, retching, and maybe their illness has nothing to do with what's in their antelope, with the food they just ate, but it's still a smart thing for you to start vomiting too, because better safe than sorry. So that's why scientists think this is why the phenomenon of sympathetic vomiting occurs. You get a head start in just ejecting all these nasty pathogens from your body.
Last question, and then maybe I'm sure you have questions, but I was thinking, we can't leave the room without kind of discussing this current political cycle that we're in at the moment, and how some politicians I don't think they actually have read this book and understand the evolution of our disgust reaction, but how it can be used, however crudely and incorrectly, to elicit our fears and perhaps our tendency to vote one way or the other.
Yeah.
That was really well, subtly. And you know exactly what I'm talking about.
And you notice there was a certain person's name that she omitted mentioning. Yes, I think that certainly during the current election cycle, that parasites actually have, something to do with the nasty tenor of, these primaries. And how best to put it?
Eliciting fear, right? Eliciting our own fear of.
Right. I mean, basically, think about it. What are sort of some of the hot button topics right now? It's immigration, patrolling Muslim neighborhoods, on the sexual front, very conservative groups that, they're into virginity pledges, very anti-homosexuality. A lot of their morals may be sort of disgust-based, and politicians can capitalize on this. I mean, that's not to suggest that the reason people are anti-immigration is because they're worried about germs. No, I don't think that's the case. I mean, their first concern might be, that they're going to, foreigners are going to take the
Remember that. It's part of our peer response.
I think that disgust is very useful in that it draws our attention to the fact that perhaps a moral boundary has been crossed. But we should, in my view, we should never base our morals on disgust alone, because disgust did not evolve as a litmus test of morality. It evolved to keep us safe from parasites. So the two are not always the same. What disgusts us is not necessarily immoral. And a lot of people rely more heavily on what they call the moral intuitions, and that's disgust.
Do any of you have any questions for our author over here? Yes, ma'am, in the pink.
First of all, thank you very much. It was very interesting. After doing so much research, have you seen that you've changed your diet in any way?
I am not at all disgust sensitive. And that's probably why I was able to write this book. It's very interesting. The scientists that are drawn to this field tend to fall into one of two groups. Either they are so disgust sensitive. In one case, the scientist actually has to have all of his graduate students program the disgusting imagery because he will just gag. So some of them are attracted to the field because they realize that this emotion has so much power over them. And so that's the reason they wanted to study it. Others are like myself, and they're just very hard to disgust.
Yes, all the way in the back.
I have a question why certain cultures seem to tolerate such levels of lack of sanitation. For instance, India, there are a lot more toilets than are actually used. People that have a toilet will still out in the field and not use the toilet. Do you have an explanation as to how certain cultures seem to tolerate such a high level of what we would definitely consider disgust in North America?
People around the world, research shows, are disgusted by the same things. However, that doesn't mean that we're all disgusted to the same level. Culture most definitely plays a role in, your disgust sensitivity. So you basically have kind of a central template, but it gets modified from one culture to the next.
Yes, ma'am.
I was a little puzzled about the barnacle because if 100% of the crabs in the Mediterranean have them,
It's like shaker barnacles.
generation of crabs. I'd always thought that parasites
Yeah.
were kind of very careful not to kill off all the possible hosts.
Right. Lynn just asked the question of how can the parasite colonize 100% of crabs in the Mediterranean and not basically go extinct, which is a very good question. And what I said is that they parasitize 100% of the crabs in certain parts of the Mediterranean so that they're able to actually continue to, regenerate.
Sir?
I'm curious about the New York Times article that said that having more variations in your microflora makes you actually stronger and more resistance to new ones. And with fecal transplant successes that have come up recently, could it be that we're overly sensitized to this cleansing of
That's
our body?
the hygiene hypothesis.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, there's a lot of people who think that is indeed the case, that that you really need to encounter a lot of different microbes early in life to fine-tune your immune system and to be able to tell, basically good bacteria from the enemy. And so now that we're raising children in much more hygienic environments, they're not being exposed to as many germs, so they don't have as rich and varied a microbiota. And then on top of everything else, the antibiotics, the antibiotics are a big issue because they kill off a lot of bacteria. Now, normally, after you finish taking antibiotics, frequently a lot of the many bacteria will return to the gut, will repopulate the gut, but often not as many organisms return. And new research is actually showing that lack of diversity in your gut bacteria can correlate with obesity. So that people who are obese are more likely to have less diverse gut bacteria. And children who've had 7 or more cycles of antibiotic treatment in childhood, by their teen years, they're about 3 pounds heavier than children who have not had as many antibiotics. And that doesn't sound like that big a difference, but as we age, the difference becomes cumulative. So by middle age, the difference can be actually quite considerable. And one of the scientists in the field said, that the antibiotics we take in childhood may determine our body mass index for life.
I'm wondering if some of the microbes are causing epigenetic changes, and also are there recommendations for how to change that? Okay, for changing cat litter, I guess just wear gloves. Yeah, right. Yeah. So one of your questions is, are gut bacteria causing epigenetic changes? What epigenetic changes means is changes in how our genes are expressed. So the genes themselves aren't changed. It's just, whether they get turned on or off, or, how much of a particular chemical gets produced. And I think it's a very good guess that gut microbiota do cause epigenetic changes, because we know that they play a critical role in the wiring of the brain in the first weeks of life. In fact, there is a new, soon-to-be published study that blew my mind. Basically, the scientist who did this research, his name is Emran Mayer, he's on the West Coast. He can look at an MRI of your brain and tell you what are the most abundant gut bacteria that are inside you. And apparently the gut bacteria influence the volume and density of your gray matter, and they also influence the white matter tracts that connect different regions of the brain.
I'm going to go buy some acidophilus today. I'm going straight to Whole Foods. Sir?
Yes?
I was equally interested about the section in your book that discussed the parasitic wasp that stings some kind of an orb weaver or something in South America. Is that right? Anyway, the larva, what chemicals? I'm just perplexed by the concept of dramatically altering behavior, like the way a web is formed, and making some kind of a three-dimensional change in that just through chemistry. That's really intriguing to me, and I'm wondering if scientists are looking into those chemicals that are released for potential psychopharmacological applications or things like that.
Well, certainly in the case of our gut microbe microbiome, the gut bacteria. Scientists are now very busily screening bacteria because, most bacteria do not produce neurotransmitters or other psychoactive compounds, but some do. And so they are trying to identify these particular strains, and then they are sort of cloning the chemicals they produce, and they're testing them on rodents. And the hope is that they may find chemicals, perhaps ones that work a lot better than, for example, the Prozac or Valium or whatever, chemicals we're using today, but ones that our bodies actually produces and recognize. So there's a very, very fertile area of research is screening gut microbes for those that are producing psychoactive compounds. Yeah, the pharmaceutical industry is hugely interested in that.
Folks, I'm going to have to cut off the live stream presentation right now because we're out of time, but I want you to all stay seated, and we'll ask some more questions. But I just wanted to remind the live stream audience, give us a call. We'll get a book autograph for you, and we'll ship it to you. And that will be good night to you, and the rest of you can finish asking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you.